LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, how to predict the future. One of my favorite movies of all time is Back to the Future.
Wait a minute, Doc. Are you telling me that you built a time machine out of a DeLorean?
The way I see it, if you're gonna build a time machine into a car, why not do it with some style? Besides, the stainless steel construction made the flux dispersal. Look out!
What if I told you that if you want to build a time machine, you don't need a stainless steel car, or any car for that matter? What if I told you that if you want to visit the future, all you have to do is close your eyes? It's May 30th, 2032. I wake up to the smell of fresh coffee, brewed with nutrients, probiotics, and antioxidants, modified daily based on my iPhone's blood monitor analysis. I'm excited because today is Sunday, and every Sunday, my almost perfect wife and I host a brunch salon. Yes, brunch is still a thing in the future. Oh, that reminds me, I have to go pick up our special guest at the airport. So I drain my cup of coffee, throw on some clothes, and slide down the fire pole that goes straight from my bedroom to the garage. I don't own a car anymore, but I do share a pool of custom cars with a club, and today I've reserved the 1973 Cadillac convertible. No, that's not quite how it sounds. You see, this Cadillac is special. Covered in a kaleidoscopic fractal pattern, it's built on a Tesla sled, fully electric. En route to the airport, I asked my AI assistant, Fred, can you suggest an opening toast for brunch based on the podcast we did 10 years ago?
Would that be the interview that ran on May 26th, 2022, about the book Imaginable?
Yep, that's the one.
I'll get right on it.
Now that I think about it, I realize I can probably write a better toast myself.
I heard that.
It's nothing against you, Fred. Don't be so sensitive. It's just that I remember this particular podcast conversation like it was yesterday. That's why I'm going to the airport to collect the author myself instead of sending a self-driving car.
Oh, I like this. I mean, so my mind is jumping all over the place as a good futurist. So interestingly, I give you two homework assignments based on this amazing thing you've imagined. One is to search a little bit around the future of coffee. The other homework assignment is that we should get to know each other better. Rufus, you're imagining me in your future. And I was trying, if we're such good friends that I'm rolling up to your Tesla sled in 10 years, we should definitely plan to talk again sometime in the next 10 years.
That's Jane McGonigal, future forecaster, game designer, and New York Times bestselling author, my guest on the show today, and I hope at a brunch salon 10 years from now. In her latest book, Imaginable, How to See the Future Coming and Feel Ready for Anything, even things that seem impossible today, Jane writes, the state of the planet is one of collective shock. Need proof? How about this? In the past 2 years, there were 2.5 million news stories with the word unimaginable in them. Now, I'm guessing that a lot of those stories were about the COVID-19 pandemic. Who could have seen that coming, right? Well, Jane did. Back in 2010, she ran a future simulation game for the World Bank where, and I'm quoting from the book now, 20,000 players were immersed in a future world that was dealing with a global respiratory pandemic that had started in China and an outbreak of social media-driven misinformation and conspiracy theories about the pandemic, and historic wildfires up and down the west coast of the United States due to climate change, and a shocking collapse of the power grid due to aging infrastructure and extreme weather. Talk about clairvoyant. Though that's not really the point of Jane's work. She doesn't run these simulations so she can look back a decade later and say, I told you so. She runs them because the latest research in psychology and neuroscience shows us that if we train our minds to imagine the unimaginable, we will be better prepared if the unthinkable actually comes to pass. That's what happened to the folks who participated in Jane's pandemic simulation. When COVID-19 hit, they didn't feel panicky and helpless like so many of us did. They knew what to do, and they acted accordingly. In Imaginable, Jane shares techniques we could all use to predict the future, and maybe even influence it. She invites her readers to imagine in vivid detail what their lives will be like in 10 years. What global trends will impact us in the coming decade? How should we respond to looming crises like extreme heat from climate change or the radicalization of young people via social media? What are the things we should get excited about? Universal basic income? The chance to reinvent higher education? If we can learn as individuals and as a society to anticipate what's coming and respond to it creatively, we'll be in much better shape when the future rolls around. Jane's book has been a hit with our curators. Adam Grant called it eye-opening and actionable. Dan Pink said reading it was like, quote, sitting down with a creative, optimistic friend and getting up as a new version of yourself. It's always occurred to me that change is inevitable, so it's good to befriend change. Jane has this great comment about befriending your future self. And your future self is going to be different, and that's a beautiful thing. This process of imagining your life 10 years from now is an invitation to embrace positive change and put it into action.
I'm Kwame Christian, and I am the CEO of the American Negotiation Institute, and I want you to check out my podcast, Negotiate Real Change. Listen to conversations with leaders in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, and learn the secrets behind what it really takes to become a successful advocate, ally, and change maker in your organization. Check out Negotiate Real Change on your favorite podcast player.
Jane McGonigal, welcome to the Next Big Idea podcast.
Thank you, Rufus. I'm so excited to be here. I listen all the time.
I love it. Well, Jane, I've always thought I had a pretty cool job, but I think you might win the coolest job contest, right? Director of Games Research and Development at the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto. You also teach a class at Stanford called How to Think Like a Futurist. Do you think you have one of the coolest jobs on the planet?
I definitely have one of the hardest to explain what I do jobs, which I think is often very closely aligned with having a cool job, for sure.
Yeah, I can see you at like parent night, like, oh yeah, doctor, lawyer, futurist, and games developer.
Let me tell you, I have 7-year-old twin daughters. They just started school this year, and it has taken me until now, May, a whole school year, for any of the parents that I've met to truly understand. Oh, I get it. So it's taken, a whole school year.
I can imagine. Well, and your path from studying video games and designing video games to working as a futurist, some would see that as counterintuitive. I think you see this as a logical progression. Why does that sequencing make sense?
What first really fascinated me about the gaming community was this trend that I was observing in gamers noticing that they were developing real skills, real abilities, collective intelligence, collective imagination that they wanted to apply in a bigger context, maybe help solve some real world challenges, work with scientists. And now this was back in 2001 when I was starting my PhD work. And I thought, this is amazing. It would be really good for humanity if we could indeed find a way to channel some of these new skills that are coming out of online gaming into real world problem solving. But at that time, there were not a lot of games to play that actually connected this community with real world challenges. And for me, after studying it for 5-6 years, writing my dissertation on this topic, I rolled right into, I'm going to be the one to make some games that help gamers apply those strengths to real world contexts. And the context that I wound up working in was trying to anticipate hard to predict futures or apply that collective imagination to seeing future scenarios from massively many points of view, the same way that we see a game world, so that we might kind of discover the outlier risks or unexpected opportunities. And that's what I've been doing now since it's been 15 years now.
So cool. And you're also an advocate for video games more broadly, I believe. And by the way, my kids, who rarely listen, but maybe they will this time, will be thrilled to hear that playing a lot of video games could potentially get you places. I think you've said every human being should participate in some gaming culture in the same way that every human being should read and should exercise.
Yes.
Now, in the parenting circles I travel in, this would raise a few eyebrows. Why do you think we should all play video games?
There's a really beautiful experience that happens when we learn a new game. And so maybe I could even expand this to say we should all be participating in new game communities, right? Exposing ourselves to experiences that have been intentionally designed to be challenging and to frustrate us and to require us to learn new skills and think creatively and ask others for help. And when we are frequently exposing ourselves to these types of challenges, then we get the opportunity to experience personal growth, personal development, build confidence in our ability to get better at something that we are objectively quite bad at the first time we try it. And that is generalizable. That is the biggest finding from game studies, the field of game research over the past 20 years, that people who do play games a lot and specifically are willing to learn how to play new games do develop this incredibly powerful confidence in their ability to learn new skills and get better at challenges through their own efforts and attention and the help of others. Because really the gaming community is a teaching community, right? With all of our wikis and our live streams, we're all helping each other get better at these games.
So this mission to take our interest in gaming and collective kind of imagining exercises and use that to help us better understand possible future outcomes. You and your team have been engaged in this for a while, as you say, and you have kind of an astoundingly impressive track record at anticipating possible future outcomes. Can you share some of the details of what you all have done?
Sure. I mean, 2020 was a really strange year to be a future forecaster. In that, I had an experience, but I think many forecasters had this experience of living through a very difficult future that we had been forecasting for a decade or more. And my work at the Institute for the Future did involve creating these simulation games, these social simulations, way back in 2008, 2010, where we were inviting thousands of people to spend weeks in a private social network where it would look like Twitter, look like Facebook or Discord, but everything being posted and shared was about a hypothetical possible future. And futurists love to look 10 years ahead because that gives us enough sort of mental distance to think more creatively and freely. And also, if we're imagining problems that might not happen for 10 years, it gives us enough time to prepare for them or prevent them. So we were looking at the years 2019 and 2020. And back then, our simulation centered around how would we survive and adapt to a respiratory pandemic that started in China that was also complicated by cascading crises. One of the things that I specialize in is figuring out how different crises and disruptions would intersect. So we're not just looking at it from a public health perspective or an epidemiology perspective, but also supply chains and social media. So we were also thinking about how would we survive and adapt when we have the supply chain disruptions, when there is misinformation and conspiracy theories about the pandemic being spread on social media, when there are historic wildfires and extreme heat waves due to climate change. And that's just what we lived through in 2020. And what made me sort of crazy for a little while, feel crazy, and want to write the book Imaginable is that there was this incredible proliferation of news stories and headlines using the word unimaginable to describe the pandemic and its consequences. And it clearly wasn't unimaginable. Maybe we didn't have enough of sort of critical mass of people imagining it. We had, 20,000 people in one of our simulations and 8,000 in another. My goal is to have 20 million, I think would really help us prepare for the future.
It's just astonishing that in 2008, 2009, 2010, that you were running these exercises anticipating a virus originating in China. I mean, to some degree, there must have been some good luck in just that forecast. But then what was even more astonishing was some of the human responses, right, that your exercises revealed that ended up being predictive of some of what we've struggled with in the last couple of years.
Yeah, so let me give you a few examples. My favorite thing about these social simulations, they don't work like a typical computer simulation where you design some algorithms, you punch in some data, you hit a button, and then the computer says, okay, here's what would happen. This many people would get infected. This many people would lose their jobs. We don't ask the computer to tell us what would happen. We ask the participants, and we ask really down-to-earth practical questions like, let's say you have been told to isolate or quarantine. You've been exposed, you're sick, you have to stay at home for 2 weeks, you can't go to work. Under what circumstances would you violate this order or not follow these instructions? Tell a story. And so people would write stories like a social media post and say, okay, well, look, I'm going to church because this is so important to me and I can't abandon my faith, even if I'm supposed to isolate. Or they would write stories about going to their daughter's wedding or a funeral. And in fact, all of the things that people said they were most likely to violate quarantine or isolation orders for became the super spreading events in 2020. And in February 2020, we hosted a webinar at the Institute for the Future trying to share some of our findings from having run these pandemic simulations. And,
wow.
I'm there on YouTube. You can find the webinar. Yeah. And I'm like, hey, if you lead a congregation, you run a synagogue, you've got some worship practices that you're in charge of, you're going to have to make them virtual. Get ready, because this is the number one thing people are going to put themselves at risk for. And that is literally worldwide turned out to be true. All of the seating events, they were religious gatherings because it is so important to people. And the thing that experts can miss by trying to make predictions about behavior during, any kind of crisis like a pandemic is if you don't talk to enough ordinary people, it is actually kind of hard to predict because people make irrational choices. Yep. They're driven by values. They take risks we wouldn't guess they would take. So yeah, just talking to ordinary people and collecting that lived experience, like people are imagining what they would do. They're using their own knowledge of themselves and their needs and their hopes and their fears and the values. That is really good, actionable information. And it makes me hopeful that if we continue to run these kinds of games, hopefully with more people over time, that when we face these new unthinkable events, that we will have thought about it and we'll have some data that we could apply.
Yeah. And when we think about this objective, which I think, having read your book, is a very important objective of turning us all into futurists, right? I think what a lot of people ask is, "Oh, I'm not clairvoyant. I can't see the future." And you point out that, actually, your job as a futurist is not to be an expert in every domain. We have plenty of experts. They're climate scientists and epidemiologists and national security researchers and economic forecasters, and it's really like all of this was stuff that we could foresee. It sounds like what you and your team are doing is listening to the experts and then engaging, significant samplings of people in exercises of imagination in order to anticipate human responses and think through unintended consequences and as you say, how these kind of multiple different changing dynamics could intersect.
That's right. And it's really important for me to underline what you just said. There's nothing magic about the forecasts that I have made. Anybody who was talking to experts in 2008 and 2010 were making similar forecasts. What we need to, I think, build our collective capacity to do is our willingness and our ability to pay serious attention and serious imagination to scenarios that, I don't know, maybe we don't want to think about them because it seems like it would be scary to think about them. We kind of will put it out of our mind. We'll deal with it if we ever actually have to live through it. Or to put information in our minds, to expose ourselves to enough clues about the future that we can imagine things that we might otherwise call unimaginable just because we don't know about them. Like, what would it be like to live through a massive geoengineering effort? Well, if you don't know anything about those technologies and what the possible benefits and maybe risks or downsides are, you literally can't imagine it because you just don't have any information. So it's not that we need to have a crystal ball. It's that we need to be willing to put that emotional energy and that mental energy into sitting with things that maybe sound like they should be scary to imagine. But actually, it turns out when you give yourself permission and that 10-year timeline, right? Because we're always imagining things that are 10 years out. So it's not that scary because it's not going to happen until, you've got plenty of time. Use that confidence that comes from imagining far in advance.
Well, and it struck me reading your book that there are two reasons why this kind of anticipation or this kind of imaginative exercise is really important. One is obviously that, we need to anticipate future developments to try to steer clear of them or improve the world. We're Homo prospectus. This is what we're good at. This is what we're supposed to be as a species, better at than other animals. And, there's a lot of practical value there. But the second is this psychological factor, right? That, as you point out, people are really despondent right now. And I was astonished by this study published in The Lancet surveying 10,000 young people between the ages of 16 and 25 to find out how anxious climate change makes them. 75% said they think the future is frightening. 59% are extremely worried about climate change. 45% said those worries are negatively affecting their daily lives. And these are our young people, who are like almost paralyzed with anxiety.
Well, and you left out my like what I consider the most stunning finding from that study, which is that a majority agreed with the statement, humanity is doomed and I have no future. That inability to imagine the scale of positive action that societies could take, that sense that there is no solution to what is looming, that's really the space that I want to intervene by creating these scenarios where we're not just imagining risks. Many of the scenarios that I develop for games and that are unimaginable are descriptions of incredible global scale efforts to solve problems in ways that might be, again, difficult to adapt to at first. It would be a little bumpy road, but to try to plant some seeds of imagination so that these young people say, okay, there's at least one road ahead that I can imagine. It might be hard to get to, and we're going to have to, create new forms of protest and movements and politics and whatever it will take. But at least I can see that I do have one possible future that I would be excited to wake up in.
Yeah. Well, as it happens, Jane, this morning I had a conversation with my brother, who's a climate scientist. And he has been banging pots and pans for decades now, telling me and our family and everyone else he knows, like, folks, we got a really serious problem coming. Here's a brief clip from my conversation with my little brother, Bronson, this morning.
Climate change is forcing our hand to leap forward into a better world, or we're screwed. And that is a double or nothing bet. Strangely, I'm optimistic. If we lean into this thing, we can fix it and we can actually make the world even better than it was before.
And so his view on the making the world better than it was before is that actually, other objectives we have, like having more biodiversity, having more protected, beautiful landscapes, having clean energy and clean air, that we're now seeing an inflection point where there's dramatically more investment in new technologies. For him, it's been very disorienting because he spent 20 years feeling like the world is oblivious, and just the last several years feeling like the world had just become despondent and is not recognizing that there's still a lot of room to do a lot of things to end up with a much better world than we think.
Absolutely. I'm really glad you shared that clip. That's amazing. It reminds me of something that the historian and activist Rebecca Solnit always says, that the root of the word emergency is emerge, right? So we are in a climate emergency, but out of that, new things will emerge, new solutions. And I mean, we can electrify everything, and then we'll have clean energy, and then we'll have abundance, and all the people we hire to make that transition to clean solar and wind, that will be incredible job building and job expansion, and people will learn new skills. So there'll be more schools. And I mean, there's so much positive that we can imagine. Can I share with you a signal of change that has also reinforced, exactly what your brother said and what what we're talking about. So we have these things that we track and share and analyze as futurists called signals of change. They're just real things that are happening today that give us a sneak peek at what the future might be like. And there's some new language that I'm very excited about that I'm starting to see pop up on social media and hear out in the wild. And it's an adaptation of the phrase, okay, boomer, which was, sort of derogatory, dismissive thing to say.
Sure.
People, older generations' mindsets, stuck mindsets. The new version of that, have you heard the new version of that, Rufus?
I don't know if I have.
It's okay, doomer. And
interesting. I have not heard that.
Yes, right. So it's a way of dismissing, I guess, people who are overly anxious or hopeless about climate change, specifically right under that 16, the 16 to 25-year-olds in that Lancet Planetary Health Journal study, they're definitely feeling hopeless, but right under them, get under 16, and you've got the next generation wants to swing the pendulum in the other direction.
I wonder sometimes whether there's an asymmetry between the obviousness of problems and the obviousness of solutions. I mean, we see these problems mounting in slow motion. It's like a slow motion, train wreck or car accident. Like we're just watching this happen with climate change in slow motion. It's very painful. We also obviously see a lot of other, issues right now with, geopolitics and social media's impact on ever greater polarization. But somehow I think the solutions are less obvious than the problems and somehow feel less inevitable. And it's not clear to me whether that's because of human wiring. Are we just naturally anxious? Is there a bias towards alarmism in the media? Where do you think it comes from?
Oh, such good questions. So juicy. Okay, let's dive into this. So first, there is certainly that negativity bias. It's the same thing as when you get feedback on your job and you hear 100 wonderful things and one negative thing, and that one negative thing is the only one that you actually think about and get stuck in your brain. The same thing can happen to us when we're looking for signals of change. We can really get stuck on the ones that seem scary, or they seem like they're a signal of risk or a signal of crisis. And one really important habit that I teach people to practice when I teach how to think like a futurist and unimaginable is to actively balance what we're planning into our imagination. So we talk about positive imagination and shadow imagination. Everybody actually has a different tendency. Some people really do, you might call them the techno-optimists, especially in Silicon Valley. Some people are sort of naturally, they collect all the good stuff and maybe they downplay the risks or maybe unintended harms. Other people are more naturally drawn to their shadow side, and it's very easy for them to see what could go wrong or predict complications. And what we need to do, all of us, is balance out that natural tendency. And for me personally, there's a very simple habit that I practice when I start to feel like I'm hearing a lot of negative signals and I want to feel confident that there are solutions. We literally just go to Google News, go to Google Scholar, and type in what you would like to see. See if you can just manifest through a search engine things that would give you more hope and confidence. And what I find is that on any given day, there will be a news story about a breakthrough idea, a new policy that's being experimented with. It's a new clinical trial that's getting started. Just go type in something you're interested in, future of food, future of democracy, and then add some positive words, new solution, breakthrough, positive advances, amazing experiment. And all that information is out there. We just have to make sure we're planting those seeds in our mind alongside the kind of doom and gloom.
I think it should be said, by the way, that the 16 to 25-year-olds are not wrong, right? In the sense that actually, that a certain amount of anxiety about the future is probably a healthy adaptation, as long as we use that anxiety to motivate us in positive directions and also remain aware of the breadth of solutions. We had Ray Dalio on the show recently who
listened to that episode.
Oh, you did? Oh, great. And I love his motto, if you're worrying, you don't have to worry, but there's an interesting sort of complexity to that, which is to say you should be worrying. But once you've done the sort of diligent, conscientious thing, which is to be anticipating and taking actions to prevent negative outcomes, then you should, stop worrying. Right?
Yeah. Well, right. That's what I say in the book. I'm like, worry for 5 minutes and then stop. But let me say two things to that. First, you're right that what we might identify as negative emotions are actually very beneficial, especially during times when we need to act. And I wanted to point out an interesting study just came out in the Journal of Climate Change and Health. And they found that there is a positive emotion they identify as eco-anger. So this is like a kind of righteous anger about failure to act on climate change. And they found that people who feel eco-anger, it actually leads to better personal well-being. Like, it's not a sense of powerlessness or hopelessness, which is actually very harmful to our health, feeling out of control, feeling the negative stress, that if we get angry about it, then we're fired up. We actually feel motivated. We look for opportunities to communicate and advocate and act. And it actually does lead to people also taking action. So anger, we don't always think about as a positive emotion, but when it comes to the environment, if we can move from anxiety to anger, that will be very productive and
Interesting.
Helpful for ourselves. The other thing that I wanted to say about, how much do we have to worry? I found it very helpful to actually dig into the scientific literature to try to figure out how long do we have to spend imagining the risky scenarios, the next pandemic, let's say it's tick-borne and it makes everybody allergic to red meat and other animal products. How long exactly do we have to imagine that? It only takes 5 minutes of active imagination. So just literally as vividly as you can, I'm living in this world, meat is banned, you can't cook out because meat is airborne now. Imagine it for 5 minutes and then that's it. That's enough. Now your brain is trained. And if there are news stories about it, if the ticks are appearing in the part of the world where you live more frequently, or a friend has symptoms of this new illness, your brain is ready to notice that change faster and jump into action. So you don't have to walk around anxious and imagining terrible things all the time. Just, pick a few scenarios, spend 5 minutes in each world, and then your brain is fired up just in case.
Mm-hmm. And I love the detail that you received a bunch of emails from people who participated in your 2008, 2010 studies who felt empowered. I mean, they very early on saw what was happening with COVID, took the necessary precautions, and really felt ready for it, right? And were in a much psychologically healthier place because they'd been through this exercise.
Yes, it was really interesting. I don't know that it actually prevented anybody from catching COVID-19, but the people who were writing me earlier, they said things like they were feeling less anxiety than others. They had more clarity, that they weren't in denial. They were able to shut things down faster and move ahead with virtual versions faster. And they just sort of opted out of that early phase where it was like a combination of denial, which was not productive, and just feeling like, I don't understand it. This is like unthinkable, what's being asked of me, what we're seeing. People who had previously imagined it vividly were able to skip past that sort of shock and getting stuck or frozen with anxiety and just get to the business of, rolling up our sleeves and living through it as best as we could. I think that should not be underestimated or valued. In Imaginable, I write about some research looking at the idea of essentially pre-traumatic exposure, where if we are reading stories about difficult things that we might need to live through, or we're vividly imagining it, when we do experience it, the first emotion we have is a sense of premonition or pre-recognition, right? Okay, I knew this could happen. Yes, I saw this coming. And that is a positive emotion. It gives us a sense of like we were smart enough to take it seriously or think about it. We had that clarity. And even though it may not have changed whether it happened or not, I mean, we're still going to have to live through it. But even starting it from that level of confidence and feeling like we knew this could happen, so we're just a little bit more ready, that can change our whole emotional experience of a crisis. And so I think that is valuable. And if more of us have that sense of pre-recognition, that we will be able to adapt to these otherwise unthinkable events better.
You know, I also just loved the very personal exercise of asking yourself, not where do you want to be, what do you want to get accomplished in the next month, where do you want to be a year from now, but what would you like your life to look like in 10 years, right? Imagine that. And you refer to it as this generates a feeling of time spaciousness.
Yes.
Rather than time debt. And it was amazing when I did this exercise myself, and almost immediately I did feel this sense of sort of an expansive possibility. It was very, very relaxing to think about my life in 10 years, right? Because all this sort of frenetic urgency that we feel about, I mean, even thinking about where I'd like to be a year from now, I'm still in this constricted mindset of like a Tetris-like experience of trying to fit too many things in a small space, right? Of operating. It's a world of constraint opposed to one of abundance, right? And I think there's some studies that bear this out. One of which, by the way, was amazing, would say that people with imminent deadlines procrastinate more than people with deadlines that are far off. I thought that was extraordinary.
Yes, I mean, just as a fun way to play with this new habit of giving yourself luxurious deadlines, I do tell people to go set like a deadline on their calendar to finish reading Imaginable in the next 10 years. And because it turns out that when we give ourselves these long, luxurious deadlines, we feel time rich. And when we feel time rich, we think, I have all this time. I can do what I want. I can do what matters to me. When we have urgent deadlines or too many tasks on our to-do list for today, we feel time poor, time deprived, and then we just don't use our time because even though we still have the same amount of time, we don't use it because it feels scarce. So there is a kind of like psychological, there's like almost like a mind hack aspect to it. But another thing that researchers have found is when we imagine 10 years out, we do tend to think about things that are more relevant to our most important values, the kinds of goals that would help us live a life that we would consider really authentic, really true to our dreams, or what we find meaningful and purposeful. So I give people this challenge of just, it's not just like, where would you like to be in 10 years or what would you like to be different? To try to vividly imagine waking up on a specific day. You know, you pick a day of the week. Is it a Monday? Is it a Saturday? Is it a Sunday? You imagine yourself waking up and you try to picture it, every detail. Where are you? Are you in the same room that you woke up in today, or is it a different room? You know, where is it? Is there somebody with you? Is it a person? Is it a pet? Is it a different person or pet than you might wake up with today? And then, you know, imagine what mood are you in? Like, what mood would you like to wake up in? What would put you in that mood? You know, what might be on your calendar for that day that would put you in that mood you want to be in. And then I actually tell people, go put it on your calendar. You know, if you've just imagined yourself doing this amazing thing that makes you feel a certain way, go ahead and, you know, open up Google Calendar, open up your Apple Calendar. They do go 10, 20, 30, 40 years in the future and put it on your calendar. And then even better, invite somebody, invite a loved one, you know, invite your brother, invite your partner to this event 10 years in the future. It just can spark some really interesting conversations about, you know, what are our real hopes, our real dreams? What is it going to take to get there? But because we've given ourselves 10 years, then it allows us to dream bigger and also enjoy that sense of time spaciousness to, really make some changes or explore possibilities that we would dismiss as impossible today.
Let's take a quick break. When we come back, Jane and I discuss the global trends that we think will have the greatest influence over our lives in the coming decade.
Hi, I'm Kwame Christian, CEO of the American Negotiation Institute, and I have a quick question for you. When was the last time you had a difficult conversation? These conversations happen all the time, and that's exactly why you should listen to Negotiate Anything, the #1 negotiation podcast in the world. We produce episodes every single day to help you lead, persuade, and resolve conflicts both at work and at home. So level up your negotiation skills by making Negotiate Anything part of your daily routine.
Hey folks, Rufus here. If you're a fan of our interviews with physicians, scientists, or entrepreneurs, then I have the perfect podcast recommendation for you, Raising Health. Previously called BioEats World, Raising Health comes from leading venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz, A16Z. Each episode, Raising Health dives deep into the heart of healthcare, biotech, and AI with A16Z general partners. Along the way, they explore the real challenges and opportunities in health and biotech entrepreneurship. Not to mention, you'll hear raw insights and actionable advice from notable guests like Omada CEO and co-founder Sean Duffy, and AI expert and In Citro CEO Daphne Kohler. Don't miss out. Follow Raising Health wherever you get your podcasts. So understanding future forces, if we want to get better at this sort of discipline of anticipating what's coming, you mentioned the old saying, you can't change the wind, but you can adjust your sails. Mm-hmm. If you can understand the forces that are likely to be impacting our next 10 years, that can, is a really critical initial part of this process. You list in the book what you have identified as your own future forces that I guess you see as most impacting the future or your future.
Yes, it's personal. You pick the ones that you feel will most impact you, your family, and your community. So for everybody, it can actually be quite different depending on who you are, where you live, right?
Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah. And your number one was heat and drought from climate change, which is partly to do with...
I live in California.
Right?
It is absolutely going to be the number one driver of adaptation in California. And I'm optimistic that there will be positive adaptations, right? We'll emerge from the emergency with possibly a better California, but it will require change, and I expect to be changed, by that effort.
Second one you list is post-pandemic trauma, yes. which I think you say also there's sort of we can have traumatic growth.
Yes,
it's both a problem we're dealing with, but also potentially an opportunity.
Right. I mean, I wound up taking an amazing free online course from Johns Hopkins University on mental first aid as a result of sort of thinking about that future force. Like, what can I do to be ready if really, as we are seeing evident in data and trends, more people are dealing with sustained symptoms of depression and anxiety and loneliness and trauma that we've lived with and grief. So, it is something I want to be ready to help others, to be a sort of mental first aid responder to people in my life and community. But also, as you said, with any of these future forces, we're trying to balance our positive and shadow imagination. And even though post-pandemic trauma, it's not a positive future force on the whole, we do see that there's a high incidence of post-traumatic growth coming out of pandemics, where many people will say they feel personally changed and motivated to take action to improve society, to help others. And I am optimistic that, the next decade, maybe it's a little bit of eco-anger combined with post-pandemic trauma, that we are going to have a really big opportunity to change society, that people are looking around and saying, well, is that the best we could do? No, it is not. Let's try something different. So again, it's like a lot of these future, it's like, where are there opportunities for change? And we pay attention to these future forces so that maybe we can help participate in that change.
That's so interesting. Yeah. So you see this next decade as a particular opportunity. I think you referenced Toffler's book, Future Shock, which came out in 1970. And he was calling out that, hey, this is a moment where the pace of change is a traumatic force. And that's something that we need to address. And we also have to anticipate this acceleration of technology and all the effects it might have. And this is, I mean, do you think this is another decade of where there's unusual opportunity?
Yes, both an acceleration of technological change, social change. It's very much like the late 1960s, which were so turbulent politically, economically, socially, and technologically. And we're definitely, it's that time again. And we do have a choice. We can be shocked by it, or we can be ready for it. And that is part of why I feel like future thinking is having a moment. People are paying more attention to this type of skill set. Like how can we think about the future more effectively, more systematically, more strategically, more creatively? And it's almost there was a big surge in design thinking, a decade ago, and that had an important role to play in work becoming more inclusive and innovative and developing empathy. And I think we're in a similar moment now where there will be many more people picking up these skills and practicing futures thinking techniques so that we can help each other avoid future shock, because it is traumatic and we don't want to be shocked. We want to be ready.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm going to list, Jane, your other 4 future forces, and then you can pick whichever you like to talk about. Radicalization of young people via social media, widespread facial recognition technology, universal basic income, and reinvention of higher education to be more affordable, which I hope will happen before all of my kids are out of college.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, a universal basic income is I think the most clearly positive. And if I had, like, one of the questions that I like to ask people when we do futures work together is what problem or challenge do you personally feel called to help solve? And for me, this sense of insecurity and this artificial scarcity that we have designed into society is the biggest problem I feel called to hail to help solve. And it's why, we could have a whole other hour-long conversation about NFTs and cryptocurrencies and Web3. And I am really going to be on the front lines yelling, do not build artificial scarcity into the next version of the internet. It has traumatized people. It has led to suffering, real suffering. And universal basic income to me is like sort of the symbol of the alternative, right? How do we build in abundance? And any metaverse, any, cryptocurrency that really addresses all of humanity needs to have UBI built into it, as do our traditional economies.
I absolutely could talk with you about UBI for an hour because I'm 100% with you. And we had Andrew Yang on the show. And I went into that conversation, this was a few years ago, somewhat skeptical, just thinking, well, this would be lovely, but can we afford it? Is it practical? I did a few weeks of research in preparation for that. And I really came out thinking, like, you know what? This is something that is within our lifetimes achievable. And what's even more exciting about it to me than I mean, obviously, it can be transformative for so many people's lives. But I also think that the cultural impact is potentially more profound than people realize.
Yes. And, it's interesting. I was working with an economic security initiative when the idea of UBI started to get a lot of traction in Silicon Valley. And there was a lot of sort of early divisiveness and even early politicalization of this idea. Like, we don't want to, it's somehow morally wrong to give people money for free, or we'll make people lazy, or stay home and play video games all day. So I developed for this group just a really quick future imagination activity that I found really effective for getting people to sort of step out of that abstract sort of knee-jerk reaction, is it right or wrong to do this, just by asking them to imagine that they have received a $500 or $1,000 check in the mail. It comes with a thank you note. It has thanked you for something that you have done. And you're going to be receiving it every month, for the rest of your life. And also all of your friends and family members are receiving the checks. Now, just imagine, what do you do with that first check? What are you spending that money on?
Yeah,
and then imagine calling your mom and asking her, and what does she tell you that she's spending it on? And now your kids who got one, what are they doing with it? And it turned out that when people stopped thinking about the sort of big politics of it or the abstract morality of this idea, when they actually imagined in their own lives and communities what the practical, real impacts would be, they were able to just think about it in a way that was more helpful, right? And I'm hoping that we can do that for other types of transformative policies. One of the things I'm looking at that is definitely controversial is the idea of much more open immigration systems in the coming decades. And again, people get very anxious. What are we, it just seems scary. But when you ask people, what would you do if you could live anywhere?
Yeah.
Then it changes. So I do think there's something about bringing a little more personal imagination into these policy debates is also really helpful. We can get out of the divisive disagreements and just think more practically, what would I do? And how would it help me? And how would I feel? And maybe we can find our way to taking a little more action instead of being so resistant to change.
Absolutely. Yeah. And well, on the subject of managing abundance versus managing scarcity, I listened, I think it was yesterday, to your conversation with Tim Ferriss. And you talked about the future of sex. And so this would be a scarcity of orgasms versus abundance of orgasms.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And you all talked about how immersive VR porn and even potentially neural implants could result in sort of orgasms on demand, or basically much less of an experience of like, I am failing as a Homo sapien to pair bond successfully and achieve this goal I'm so driven towards, perhaps particularly for males, right, who tend to be very for young men. And I was interested in, I think it was a comment that you'd made that maybe this could have a meaningful cultural impact.
Yeah. So first of all, I will say it will be helpful if we could run a little future forecasting game around this and ask people, would you, accept this neural implant? Would you use it? How often would you use it? Would you replace, real life dating and mating rituals with it? It's good to start the conversation now before the technology is available. We have, I think, a leisurely, at least 10 years before we have to live through this. So we could start getting some real data from people about, how they feel about it. Speculatively, I will say it reminds me of, until fairly recently, humans had to spend most of our time and energy getting food. And there was no time or energy for art and culture and all the other things that we produce. I mean, literally, you would wake up and your entire day would be spent trying to get food. And that was it. That was where we put all our energy. And I think if we maybe imagine some kind of technology that allows us, in the same way that modern food technology allows us to not be thinking about how am I going to feed myself every waking moment of the day, if we can free up that same scale of time and energy for humanity away from dating and mating, that that will unleash a lot of time and energy potentially into something else. We don't know what it would be yet, but I think it could be as transformative as developing food systems and agriculture and the technologies that, I mean, it is hard to imagine how much human effort was spent just trying to sustain basic nutrition. And now we have it abundantly. So that's sort of where my mind goes with that. And I try to keep an open mind about technologies. I always try to imagine, why would people adopt this? It's interesting. It's not quite the same technology, but in 2016 at the Institute for the Future, we ran a future forecasting game about neurosensing social media platforms with 10,000 high school students. And we were asking them if there were a social network that was able to communicate unfiltered thoughts and emotions, would you sign up for it? And who would you allow to follow you? And who would you want to follow? Who would you want to feel, and who would you block? And how might it change your dating and your friendships and your relationship with your parents and activism and learning and everything? And they came up with, I think, 100,000 personal predictions. And I was really surprised by the desire that they express to get on a platform like this. I mean, I think to a lot of people, it sounds quite dystopian, like a version of Facebook or Twitter that's just sending out your unfiltered, authentic thoughts and emotions. But something I've learned over 15 years of future forecasting is we should not underestimate the appetite in young people for anything that allows people to feel seen or heard or validated.
Would you like to be the most interesting person at your next cocktail party? Want to be the person who always has a great answer to the question, read any good books lately? Want to get smarter without cutting into your precious Netflix binge time? Well, allow me to introduce you to the Next Big Idea app. Our curators, Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, Susan Cain, and Daniel Pink, have handpicked hundreds of the best new books, and we've worked directly with the authors of those books to create 12-minute audio summaries. Unlike other book summary apps, these aren't written by side-hustling college students. They're written and read by the authors themselves. And that's not all you'll find once you download the app. We also have masterclasses from authors like Shankar Vedantam and Lisa Feldman Barrett, ad-free versions of this podcast, and exclusive author interviews you can't find anywhere else. There is no better way to get smart fast. Download the Next Big Idea app today by going to your app store and searching for Next Big Idea. What I think is so interesting about this exercise of us all making efforts to become futurists is we want to be more mindful of future unintended consequences. We want to be intentional about all the sort of after effects of the changes that are introduced into our world. And probably we want to live in ways that are more connected. And I'm fascinated by what you said about the young people embracing a platform that caused your emotions and feelings to sort of flow out into the world. I mean, it had struck me with Neuralace, Elon Musk's one of his 17 companies, that one could imagine a version of Instagram where instead of sharing a photograph of yourself trekking in Nepal, you would share the sensation for 15 seconds of actually the wind on your skin and the sun and the sights, right?
Yes.
And that could be, I mean, on the one hand, there's a dystopian feeling about that, but on the other hand, it's kind of beautiful.
Yes, well, absolutely. So in our scenario, the platform was called Feel That. And we asked all of these young people, what would you want to feel? Maybe that you've never felt before, or that you don't feel like it is safe for you to feel. And there were some very moving answers. Somebody said that they wanted to feel their mother's pride for them. She had passed. But if that had been captured and she could feel how proud her mom was of her and that she could maybe pass that down through the generations. They talked about having feelings that you could pass down for generations, was beautiful. Young people exploring their sexuality who didn't feel it was safe in regions of the world where it is illegal for certain sexual practices or relationships. Could they explore that through a Feel That network? It's a weird, wonderful side effect of bringing people from around the world together to play with these future scenarios is that they do give you a glimpse into other people's inner lives, what they actually do hope for or what they worry about. And it's almost completely tangential to actually being ready for the future. I feel like my empathy for other people's lives has really expanded from hearing what people would do with different technologies or how they would adapt to different scenarios.
Interesting. Yeah, I can see that. Well, Jane, what are there any other future scenarios that you think our listeners should consider in these final minutes here?
Well, say, okay, things, if you're not paying attention to, things to pay attention to, government mandated internet shutdowns is a huge future force that is spreading globally. And if you're not aware of this phenomenon and not potentially prepared to live through weeks or months of the government turning off the internet, something to think about. I also think climate migration, starting to be willing to think about the risks where we live. Are we in a climate secure, climate resilient place that will probably be welcoming others who are migrating out of climate unsafe regions? So we should be prepared to see a higher density of living, to be welcoming to people who've been forcibly displaced. Are we emotionally ready for that? Are we economically ready for that? Or also just think about, what are our pathways to move if we need to? That is something that every serious futurist that I know, the number one thing they're thinking about are pathways of human movement within countries, across borders. How can we support people economically, socially, mentally, psychologically? How can we make a home, wherever we are? That's a problem space that warrants so much imagination and innovation and creativity. If I could get, all of the smartest minds on the planet to work on something, it would be really thinking about movement. That is the biggest, I think, future scenario that would benefit from our imagination and also our innovation.
Well, it was so great to see this reception in Europe to Ukrainian refugees in recent months, right? This sort of people welcoming refugees into their homes. And I think the first thing that comes to people's minds is when they think of sort of large scale, urgent migration is just utter, catastrophe.
Yes.
But there's certainly, and that's obviously something we need to avoid.
Well, and my favorite scenario from the book, it's called The Welcome Party. It imagines a 10-year planned, safe, equitable, fully economically supported climate migration where we could avoid the urgency, avoid the chaos, give people more of a say in where they move, give cities and countries that welcome people more support, allow it to be a win-win for everybody to facilitate this movement and to take some of that urgency out of it, because the urgency is where the fear comes from, the suffering comes from, the scarcity comes from. If we start, to imagine what we could do with that time spaciousness, right? That we were talking about earlier. Yeah. Bringing that to some of these problems is a real gift, I think, that we can take advantage of. Yeah.
And Jane, is there any hope for flying cars? I had in my hypothetical, in 10 years, I'm picking you up in an electrified 1973 Cadillac, but I'm really kind of hopeful that we'll actually get the flying cars.
I mean, they do exist, right? I think that the right search term is road ready flying vehicles. They've sort of switched it around.
Right,
but I mean, the question of personal mobility is absolutely fascinating. I'm a little more excited by high-speed trains myself than getting in a flying car. But, it's funny you mentioned that, because one thing we say is there are certain images of the future that outlive their usefulness. Yeah. And definitely the jetpacks, the flying cars, that was a symbol of the future for many decades. And I think what we're looking for now are what are the new symbols of hope for the future? What do we want to exist in the future that doesn't exist today? And it might be, to me, I think about pan-cancer vaccines, to me, that's my flying jetpack. That's the world, I want to wake up in, or 3D printers for organs, so that we don't have an organ donation crisis. So, and that's one of the fun things about practicing these future habits. We can replace the old images of the future with new ones that can help us dream of really fantastic worlds.
I love that. Well, Jane, I'm going to RSVP for your book club meeting in 2033,
yes,
which I think everyone's invited to. And I hope to see tens of millions of future futurists on that call, but it's everybody's going to love this book, Imaginable: How to See the Future Coming and Feel Ready for Anything, even things that seem impossible today.
And it's not millions yet, but it's thousands if people want to play the games in the book with others. There is a community where you can come and do that. We're running these social simulations from the book, so you don't have to play just by yourself. You can come and play with people from around the world at urgentoptimists.org. And it is super fun. And I'm the host, and we're doing game nights, and we're doing Signals of Hope scavenger hunts, and I'm having a blast. And so it's a book that you play along as you read.
Amazing. Well, I hope to see you before 2033, Jane, and thank you so much. Just utterly fascinating, and thank you for this book and for being with us today.
Thank you, Rufus.
As I think most listeners know, our mission here at the Next Big Idea Club is to connect readers and writers in powerful new ways. And one of the ways we do that is by inviting our favorite authors to create original book summaries, which we call Book Bites. These are written and read by the authors themselves. You can read them in 4 minutes or listen in 10. And our app, the Next Big Idea app, has hundreds of them, a new one every single day. I thought it might be fun to bring on one of my colleagues and find out what book bites she's been really enjoying recently. So today I'm joined by Markina Iliev-Pacelli. Hi, Markina.
Hi, Rufus.
So, Markina, why don't you tell listeners about what you do?
I'm the business development director here at Next Big Idea Club, and I like the club so much I share it with friends and family all the time and would definitely be a member even if I didn't work here. So I get to work with our enterprise and corporate clients to help them deliver the benefits of the club to all of their employees.
By the way, if you think your team at work would enjoy membership in the Next Big Idea Club, you can email Markina. Just send it to podcast@nextbigideaclub.com. So, Markina, you picked a book bite that you'd like to share with us today.
I love this book bite from Monica Guzman. It's from her book, I Never Thought of It That Way. And I found it incredibly interesting and relevant to my life right now.
Let's play one of Monica's big ideas from the book, and then I'd love to hear more about that, Markina.
Ask how, not why. Why is a naturally curious question. But in times of deep suspicion and fear and distrust, asking someone why they believe what they believe feels like they're being put on the stand. It gets them to want to justify not only what they believe, but who they are. Asking why is not actually the best strategy. They'll be tempted to give you the talking points, the echoes, the things they feel they can take some shelter under. So instead of asking why, ask how. How did you come to believe what you believe? When you ask someone how, you invite them to share their story. You don't put them on trial. You ask them to take you on a tour. And as you walk alongside them, you'll find that even if you completely disagree with the conclusions they have made, even if you find their perspective and their conclusions to be just beyond the pale, you might find something in the path they took to their conclusions that you can connect with, that you can relate to. And every time you find one of those, it's like building a base camp up a mountain. You see their pain, you see their struggle, you can acclimate, you can connect, and you can climb higher in your understanding. So for example, if you were to ask someone who disagrees with you about COVID vaccines or vaccines in general, you can ask them, where are you on vaccines? Tell me how you got there. What matters to you on this? And if you just keep asking those questions and getting curious, you'll be pretty surprised what you can find out.
Such good advice. I am dramatically less afraid of Thanksgiving. Markina, I'm really curious to know, why did that hit home for you?
When Monica talks about vaccines and having conversations with friends around vaccines, I have this wonderful group of friends that I've known even actually since elementary school. And we've been through everything together. And every summer we would visit each other and hang out in someone's backyard and all the kids would play. But about a year ago, when we were going to hang out in the summer, we found out that one of the families is anti-vax, and that caused a huge rift. So these people that I want to see again this summer, I don't know how it's going to go. And when I think about, like, will I address that conversation, will I confront them? I'll use some of Monica's tips and think about asking how. I want to hear the story of how they came to where they came on vaccines, and I want to hear what's important to them, and then maybe hopefully we can have some connection, and maybe so we can all heal together a little bit.
Well, keep me posted, Markina. I want to hear how that goes. Thank you so much for sharing this with us today, and look forward to seeing you around the office.
Thanks, Rufus. See you soon.
Thanks again to Jane McGonigal. This episode was written and produced by Caleb Bissinger. Our executive producer is Michael Kovnat. Sound design by Mike Toda. We hope to still be making this show with LinkedIn 10 years from now. I'm your host, Rufus Griscom. See you next week.